my editing skills are crap, but can the same thing be said about Terminator Genisys? Stick around and find out. Do 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 do. Do 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 do. That's your part. Keep doing it. Do 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 do. All right. Terminator movie. I'm a Terminator fan. I'm also Peter Franson from ChristianGeekCentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions, and this is my uncut review of Terminator Genisys. All right, so let's talk about this movie. John Connor. This is the IMDb synopsis, very brief. John Connor sends Kyle Reese back in time to protect Sarah Connor, but when he arrives in 1984, nothing is as he expected it to be. I'm really unclear, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more later, but I'm really unclear what movies we're supposed to ignore when watching this movie. It's clear that they are rewriting the continuity, certainly of the first movie, but it's unclear whether or not the events of the second movie still took place. They seem to be completely ignoring the third movie, maybe. I'm going to have to watch it again and see if I can make it logically work somehow. But my impression is that logic is not like a big value in this movie in terms of how time travel works. And I'll get to that in a minute. So let's talk about just overall the story, the script, the pacing. So comparing this to the other movies, the first movie was like sci-fi horror or sci-fi monster movie, It was not like, it had action elements in it, certainly, like guns and car chases and stuff like that. But I mean, I feel like at its heart, it was this, monster running from a monster type movie, kind of like Aliens or Predator. There's a monster and you're running away from it for most of the movie and trying to survive this monster and somehow kill it at the very end, And it was, it was meant to be, I think, in many ways scary. The second movie was still intense and intimidating, and the bad guy, the T-1000, was scary, but not in the same way as the first one, I don't think. It also took place a lot during the day. It just had more of an action movie feel as opposed to this, we're, trying to make our way through the night, and, it didn't have as much of that kind of sci-fi horror vibe as the first one. So more of a sci-fi action movie. The third one was like a remix of the second one, just kind of like, okay, we got another liquid metal-y type of Terminator, and now we've got the T-800 Arnold Schwarzenegger who's been reprogrammed to be good again, which was a really novel twist in the second one, and they just keep doing it again and again, and so it's kind of not novel anymore. And then the third one also mixed in some light romance, and there was returning attempts at humor, particularly with the Arnold T-800, and kind of like him simulating human behavior. Those were big gags from the second and the third movie. And then they also advanced the lore. One of the main things that the third movie did was talk about how Skynet came to be. And so I thought that added some value to the overall, mythos of the Terminator, but I think many would agree that the third movie was pretty weak and not as strong as either of the first two. Certainly not as strong as the second movie. Then you got the fourth movie, which a lot of people didn't like. I actually did quite a bit. Not as much as the second one, and it's apples and oranges comparing it to the first one, but I did really enjoy it. It's a post-apocalyptic sci-fi action movie, basically, with some interesting philosophical ideas that they were trying to play with, that they really didn't do in the first three movies, so they were trying to create a different vibe, a different feel to that fourth one, and so I respect all of the attempts at change in feel and vibe, for lack of more precise words, that the movies went for as the series progressed. So now we've got Terminator Genisys, the fifth movie in the series, if you can believe it, and it feels a lot like what they would have done with the third movie if they'd just been a little bit more creative in their choices. It's a Skynet origin redo, so we kind of get back into the origin of Skynet. That was a big part of what the third one is about, and that's a huge part of what this movie's about. So it feels like, oh, really, we're doing this again? Okay. And they even repeated one of the magnetic gags from from Terminator 3 when they were fighting, bad Terminator type things. Yeah, I'm going to really try hard not to give any spoilers. In fact, even fewer spoilers than the marketing material for this movie have given. Um, there was also more romance. I felt like it was they really were trying to push the romance in this movie. And there was more quote unquote humor, which didn't work for me, but then not a lot of humor does in movies. And then they added this time travel adventure vibe. And that's probably the biggest change to the feel overall of this movie, is that it's got action, it's got some of that, survival against a robotic menace type, thing. So they've got those elements from the previous movies, but what they add is to the whole movie. I would not throughout consistently, but this adventure movie vibe. Like, okay, we're going, here we go, we got this thing to do, and we're just kind of like on this adventure. There wasn't as much fear in the lead characters regarding the things that they were facing. Not near as much fear as the first two movies, or even the third movie, where you had Catherine Brewster at least kind of freaking out, and these guys are just kind of like, they're just trying real hard and they're focused to stay away from the bad things, But I didn't see a lot of like terror at what they were being faced with. They were pretty cool and prepared in many ways. So there were no like what I would say scary or shocking elements like even Terminator 2 had, when sometimes he would spike people through the head or something and you're just like, oh my gosh, this guy's bad, Whereas this movie, it just wasn't, the bad guys just weren't as intimidating maybe as I felt like the bad guys were in previous films. And then unlike Terminator Salvation, this movie to me felt like its PG-13 rating. I came out of Terminator Salvation and it was just such a dark tone, and that it didn't feel like a PG-13 movie. I think it was because most of the people that were getting shot up and stuff were like robots and cyborgs and stuff like that, But this movie feels more like a PG-13 adventure movie, It's got that subplot about forced romance, like, oh, we're destined to be together, so we got to make this work or whatever. But the subplot itself, I thought, felt kind of forced. Kyle doesn't seem in love with Sarah like the Michael Biehn version of Kyle Reese was in the first movie before he even met her. I mean, when he says to her, "I love you, Sarah, I always have," and I just watched the first two movies in the last few days to kind of refresh my memory, I really believed him that, like, before going through the time traveling trip, he had really been fixated on Sarah Connor and just admired her and loved her, in whatever way he could. And I didn't feel that from this Kyle, which is unfortunate because the romance was a major part of the intended part of the story. And then we've got a Sarah Connor who, I mean, I thought the actors did a fine job. It's just, I think it was just how the characters were written maybe this time around. This Sarah Connor was far less complex than the Linda Hamilton Sarah Connor of Terminator 2. Who was, driven and conflicted. She was hard because she had to be, but there was also this vulnerability about her that would show up in her private moments or when she would reach her breaking point, So, and it took nothing away from her strength as a character and her empowerment as a character, if that's something that you value in your characters, or particularly your female protagonists. I felt like that's a great model for that. I would say even more so than Ellen Ripley. Linda Hamilton's Sarah Connor was just a fantastic, strong female character. Or Furiosa from the recent Mad Max Fury Road movie. But this Sarah Connor was a little bit too cool for me, a little too adjusted to her circumstances. And I didn't feel like the plot maybe justified that. We know that she had an experience when she was very young that hardened her, but for all we know, she hasn't been living in the pits of hell fighting the future war against the cyborgs her whole life, It was, I don't know, I had trouble kind of connecting and understanding her character and why she was the way she was. She also acts and talks kind of like a modern woman, just kind of like some of the way that her dialogue sounded. It sounded like a woman that's been living, in, 2015 and the early 2000s, as opposed to like an 80s girl. It would have been kind of interesting to have just a little bit of that, period piece element where she would use like 1980s expressions. That would have been cool. But more than that, I really just wanted her to be a more complex character. And that goes for male and female protagonists. I mean, the way she was, it reminded me, ironically, of sometimes these like overly cool and capable meatheads with big machine guns, and stuff like that, who really don't have any vulnerability to them. In both whether it's a male or female protagonist, I want to see some vulnerability in that character. Otherwise, I can't relate to that, and I don't really feel any tension for them when they're up against the wall, you know. Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator, is more jokey than ever in this movie. You know, there's just plenty of scenes where it's just, oh, that silly Terminator, look what he's doing. He's trying to be human, but he's not very good at it. You know, I mean, you know, so it's just a lot more of that kind of thing. You know, they got and they've got one gag that they kind of keep coming back to, and I'm like, it was funny. It was legitimately funny the first time, but it loses impact every time after that. The time travel seems to have few, if any, rules or logic connected to it. You know, time travel for me is more actually a fantastical concept, a fantasy concept than it is a sci-fi concept. Even though it, you know, almost always involves technology and, you know, science fiction in that sense. But I mean, to find a time travel movie that really is logical through and through is really hard. But at least in a movie like, say, the Back to the Future trilogy, they try to present the rules that they are abiding by in their treatment of time travel. And I felt like this movie didn't give us enough of the rules and establish, you know, how cause and effect works and, you know, how the timeline could or could not be potentially changed. There was just a lot of gobbledygook, and the you know, technobabble itself was kind of like a joke. Like, boy, he doesn't make any sense. You know, I mean, it's like, yeah, I know he doesn't make any sense because he's saying complete nonsense. Could you at least reduce it so there's a little bit of like logic that we can kind of hold on to? And the reason that's important to me is if you don't understand like what the ramifications are for these characters' actions as they're traveling through time and changing the timeline, then for me, I lose the sense of tension. Like, okay, if this person does this, then oh, things are gonna get all messed up. Or if this person dies, then oh man, things are gonna totally go down the crapper, you know. But it seemed like they were really loosey-goosey in terms of their rules of time travel. And at the end of the day, what that did for me is just suck out a whole bunch of tension from the experience. There's a great mid-movie twist that is ruined in every trailer for this movie after the first one. So if you're lucky enough to have only seen the first trailer for this movie, don't watch any more before you watch this movie. But it's a bummer because it takes place like halfway through the movie. Halfway through the movie! Oh my gosh. It's kind of like how it was ruined in Terminator 2, where you had like, if you had never seen any promotional materials, you might wonder up until that moment when the T-1000 and Arnold Schwarzenegger are both coming at John Connor from two different directions, and you can tell the way they shot it too, was at the very least meant to help us, you know, see John's conflict and figuring out who to trust and what the crap is going on. But I think even audience members, there was only some mild hints that the Arnold Schwarzenegger Terminator was going to be the good guy in this movie instead of the guy trying to kill John, you know. Man, it would have been great. There's something in that ballpark, you know, a character doing an unexpected thing, I should say, and then playing an unexpected role in the remainder of the movie. That man, they spoil in the trailers, and it was one of the greatest, I think, kind of concepts that this movie had. And it would have been great if I wouldn't have known that going in. Because as it was, there wasn't a whole lot else that was like, whoa, I can't believe they went in that direction, you know? Without giving any spoilers whatsoever, the ending is just way too neat and tidy. All the other Terminator movies, they end, at least the theatrical releases, end with like this kind of sense of like, it's over, right? Or no, not quite maybe, or it's definitely not over, but we have time to prepare. It wasn't like this neat and tidy, like, we did it. Everything's fixed now, you know? And that's how this movie ends, you know? With one qualification, and again, no spoilers, but stick around for there's a bonus scene halfway through the credits. Just one. I watched all the credits. There's one bonus scene halfway through the credits that I think should have been right before the end of the credits, because it establishes that not everything is so neat and tidy. And I think there's certainly room for a sequel. I think that's probably their plan. Otherwise, why include that little kind of bonus scene in the credits there? But I think its proper place would have been before the end of the credits as part of the movie proper. Because like most of the audience left the theater and didn't even see that moment. And I was like, oh man, you guys, you should have seen that. That ending feels more in line with all the other Terminator movies ending on kind of like an uncertain note. I'm ready for Arnold Schwarzenegger to depart this trilogy. They came up with a logic for him to be old in this movie that totally, worked for me. Um, but I mean, I don't need him to be in these movies. I was fine with him not being in Terminator Salvation. I maybe missed the time travel not being present in Terminator Salvation, but yeah, I don't think that we need Arnold. I think the world, at least, and the characters, at least before this movie, were interesting and deep enough to be just fine with, to not be like an Arnold vehicle, like they have to have Arnold or it's not a Terminator movie. I don't feel that way at all. In fact, after this movie, I feel like this version of the Terminator has outworn its welcome for me. Like if he appears in a future Terminator movie, I think it would be really cool, especially if it's the last one he appears in, if he goes back to being the bad guy. Come full circle and have him be the one that's chasing him down the whole movie, But I don't know if I want to see that. I think they could make it work, but anyway. Yeah, and Sarah was demoted in complexity as a character, so I'm not really interested in her anymore. Like, I didn't leave the theater going like, oh man, I can't wait to see what they're going to do next. I was like, yeah, I'll watch another one. I'm enough of a fan at this point. I'll definitely watch another one if they put it in front of me. But anyway, this movie didn't like get me. It wasn't like a rebirth of the series or like a reboot or reinvigoration of the series like I kind of hoped it would be. So let's talk about the stunts and the visuals. Lots of cool visuals and action sequences in this movie. Lots of cool creative stuff that they did in terms of the action sequences. Now for me, I'm cursed with an eye that picks out CG really easily. Just like, oh, I see it, And when I'm not even looking for it, it's just like, oh, there's CG. Totally, they're looking at a tennis ball. Great, it's so exciting. All the actors are running from a tennis ball, And in this movie, I felt like the CG was pushed forward, specifically the CG that kind of brought in a young Arnold Schwarzenegger into the movie. It was pushed forward and understood its limits, I think. Because between those two things, not having him move around too much, because that's what really gives it away for me most of the time, is how biological creatures and characters move in CG. But he didn't move very much, which is appropriate for a Terminator, and also just the texture details and stuff. It was like, there was a moment where I was like, wait, is that old footage reworked, or is that CG? What am I looking at here? I mean, they were like, I was like, oh my gosh, I think they're fooling me, which would be so exciting for me, because I've been living in a terrible place ever since, the early 1990s, with all these cartoons getting mixed into our movies. So there was like some great moments like, oh, okay, no, that is CG. But I mean, if I hadn't been like particularly looking for it, I might have been fooled. So I am so excited, because to me this means, oh my gosh, there's hope for Hollywood. We might be really close. We might be 5-10 years away from CG that, when used appropriately, is indistinguishable to my eye from reality, which, oh, I would love to be there. Great creative uses of the T-1000 abilities and those of another character with similar abilities. I won't give them away, but I mean, stuff that they just didn't do in Terminator 3 that they could have done. I was just like, oh, that is such a cool thing to do with that liquid metal concept, There were several great little moments like that. It reminded me of the creative use of teleportation in the Nightcrawler White House sequence of X-Men 2, where you think, okay, a guy can just go from point A to B without any line in between. But he was doing it in slow motion and super fast going around, and it was a really creative use of teleportation in the way they applied it to a combat situation. And there was just some similar things that they did in here with these abilities that we've kind of seen before, but they're just applying them in new and creative ways. So just if you're already a Terminator fan, I think you're going to enjoy those kinds of things. If you're not a Terminator fan, I don't think it's going to be enough for you to really to really kind of rescue this movie from status, Okay, so relevance, I'll talk about briefly. Is there anything in this movie that is likely to provoke thought about, moral or philosophical or spiritual matters, I don't know, maybe. I mean, you could talk about logic. Maybe it could be a springboard for thinking or talking about logic because of the time travel and stuff and the lack of logic there. Or the old standard, AI, discussion about what makes a person a person. Are we just a bunch of stimuli and response machines and there's nothing more to us that is non-physical, you know, because they ask you really in this movie, like many movies with an AI in them, to invest emotionally in the personhood and accept the personhood of a machine character, you know, like Chappie or Johnny Five or the Terminator movies, you know, starting with 2 and going, well, onward, except for maybe the 4th one. So, you know, I think there's some stuff there, but it's not really, I don't know. For me, it, you know, I've seen that theme repeated so many times, it wasn't really a standout thing for me. Let's see. I guess the question I would ask, though, is, you know, if, you know, they want us to value the T-800 as a person, but if he is naturally a person, which they don't really explain, he's reprogrammed in previous movies, but in this movie they don't explain why he behaves and attempts to behave in the human ways that he does. If he naturally is that way, then, you know, maybe the machines aren't so bad. Maybe if they're persons, if they're real persons just like we're real persons, maybe we should give them their shot at ruling the world. You know, who are we to interfere with these people who just want to live and have a place in the world, right? Machines are people too. And if that's not the case, if he's not naturally that way, then how was he given personhood? By some programmer? Then if that's the case, then, you know, how could that be when we can't even reduce personhood to a series, you know, of numbers and mathematical equations and stuff like that, you know? Or was it just a bolt of lightning, you know, which I equate to just magic, you know? Magic, life! So anyway, let's see. In summary, if I were a time traveler myself and going back in time to talk to myself about this movie, I'd say, Pater, buy it. Maybe don't see it in the theater. Just plan on buying it, because you're enough of a Terminator fan that you're going to want it in your collection. Many people are going to be content to just rent it, however, Redbox it or something. It doesn't come near the excellence in story, characters, and performances of Terminator 2, and it recycles a few things, but it adds enough new things and tries a different tone. Which I think makes it an appropriate fit in a movie series where almost no two movies have the same feel to them. Kind of like, for me, the Alien movies. I feel like they similarly kind of change up their tone enough that it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges, you know, when you are comparing one of those movies to another. So I feel like it's kind of a good fit in this somewhat eclectic, if that's the right word, series of movies. It's rated PG-13 for intense sequences of sci-fi, violence, and gunplay throughout, partial nudity, and brief, strong language. I don't even remember the nudity. Maybe there was some dude's butt at some point, but I don't even remember that. It's more like just kind of like shots of people's backs. I don't remember. Anyway, final score. I give it a quality score of 8.0 out of 10 and a relevant score of 6.0 out of 10. All right, well, please do like, share, and subscribe if you like this video and want to share it and want more videos like it. And then I hope you will go over to ChristianGeekCentral.com and join some other geeks there as we continue to geek out and seek the truth.